in the pursuit of truth and common sense in an unbelievable world. You're listening to the Right Mind podcast with your host, Todd Schowalter.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Right Mind. I'm Todd Schowalter. Today, I have with me Steve Rubin. He is the host of his own podcast. It's called Steve Rubin's Saturday Night at the Movies, and he also has some other books coming out. One is on James Bond. The other is on the Twilight Zone. He's also a writer. He's out in L.A. He's got all kinds of stuff going on out in Hollywood. How you doing, Steve?
Great, Todd. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, well, thanks for joining us. Where do you want to start? Because you were just telling me you got so much stuff. What's at the top of your list right now? What are you working on?
Well, the book that is currently I'm charging forth with has been out for a while now. It's called the James Bond Movie Encyclopedia. It's in its fourth edition. I've been writing about James Bond since the 1970s. I've done 6 books on James Bond movies. I'm it's kind of my thing. Uh-huh. And like most of us, I was waiting around for this latest Bond movie to appear, and it finally came out. And it's had, as you probably know, and a lot of your listeners know, it's had a storm of controversy about it. I won't give away any spoilers.
Right. I actually saw it with my wife last weekend. And like I said, we can't give away the spoilers, but what were your overall thoughts on it? I mean, I'll be honest with you, after everything I heard, I went into it expecting, I didn't think I was going to like it, but I actually kind of liked it. What do you think?
Oh, I did too. I saw it at a press screening at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood, big neat. Hoopla, the ideal conditions. I saw it in IMAX. You always think of the James Bond movies as big, something that you would consider an event to go to the movies. And it goes all the way back to my childhood. I mean, I went to that same Chinese theater in 1964 to see the world premiere of Goldfinger.
Oh, wow.
And we never went up to the Chinese. That was not in our neighborhood, but it seemed like somewhat festive that year. That was the beginning of Bond fever. The first 2 James Bond movies, Dr. No and From Russia with Love, were released with very little fanfare in the U.S., and the craze had not caught on. But by Goldfinger, all of my middle school classmates were reading Ian Fleming, so it was a big deal.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was Sean Connery. Who was that? Who was before him? George.
Well, Sean Connery was first.
He was first. Okay, yeah, I didn't know that. Okay.
He did 5, and then George Lazenby replaced him because Connery was getting tired of those long schedules, etc. And then George did 1, and then they got Connery back for Diamonds Are Forever, and then they brought in Roger Moore. He did 7, followed by Timothy Dalton, who did 2, and then you got Pierce Brosnan for 4. And then starting in 2006, you got Daniel Craig. And I have to say that Daniel Craig has really become one of my favorite Bonds of all time, right up there with Connery.
Me too. And, I was really surprised. I mean, when he was originally cast, I thought, wait a minute, because I'd seen him in some other stuff and other films that he's been in prior to that. I mean, he almost played like a quirky, nerdy character. And then he comes out and all of a sudden he's James Bond. I thought, wow, what is this all about? But he really, in my opinion, is one of the best.
He is, and he was the Bond that they needed to reboot the series with. The Bond films have gone through all sorts of permutations. They were serious, they were funny with Roger Moore. It's funny, the Roger Moore films get disparaged today because they don't date very well. But when they came out, really in the 70s, with his third attempt, The Spy Who Loved Me, which had that great Carly Simon song, big event filmmaking, and that started a complete revival of the series after it had dipped down a little bit. So you got to give Roger credit for reintroducing the series to a whole new generation of Bond fans who weren't really familiar with Connery. So they've gone through all these permutations, but by the early 2000s, the world had become much darker. Mm-hmm. And the threat of international terrorism, you couldn't do funny anymore as part of a serious Bond series. So they brought in Daniel, and I have to say this, when we first heard about Daniel Craig, we were always saying, oh, give me a break, a blonde Bond.
Yeah, right.
His first film, Casino Royale, literally was jaw-dropping. I mean, that opening sequence where Bond chases this bomb maker on these construction cranes, and the guy's a parkour specialist.
Right.
Wow.
Well, and the thing is, I keep hearing, and he said the same thing about he wasn't going to do another one. I mean, these people that play the part apparently just get so worn out, I guess, physically or whatnot. But I got to tell you, if I had an opportunity to play any part, James Bond would be right up there, wouldn't you? It must be exhausting, but boy, I wouldn't want to turn that one down.
Well, it's interesting because your quote unquote serious thespians, have to do the challenge every so often to restore their creative juices. So, some actors would not like to be tied down for 5 or 7 years or 15 years in Daniel Craig's place, but it's such an iconic role. And I have to say that they've done it so well over the years. I mean, this series this year is 60 years old. Come on.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, it goes all the way back to 1962. And I think that they've kept it really, the quality has always been very high. Some of the movies are not as good as the others, but the quality of the filmmaking has always been terrific. And I think that I always joke that there are 3 things certain in life: death, taxes, and James Bond movies.
That's right. That's right. What, mind my asking, what was your favorite?
The first movie I saw, going all the way back to Goldfinger. It still holds up for me. I can quote dialogue from it. It's, he's lying spread-eagled on that table, and the laser beam's headed for his privates. And he says to Goldfinger, "Do you expect me to talk?" And Goldfinger says, "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die."
Right.
I mean, that's so plays.
I mean, there's so many iconic lines from that.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when he's introduced to the girl on the airplane. "Who are you?" "My name is Pussy Galore." And he says, "I must be dreaming."
Right. Well, now that brings me to another point. I mean, along with a lot of other films, I mean, there are certain things that, James Bond is known for. I mean, do you think, they were talking about having to tone things down as we move forward. I mean, how do you think a Sean Connery James Bond would relate to today's world?
Good question. I think that those were very clever films. I think that the witty repartee between Bond and the characters, I think, would be appreciated. That's why Goldfinger still plays for me. But I think that the audiences today, when they hear that a new James Bond movie is coming out, they want the action. Mm-hmm. They want the action. They want it gritty and realistic. And that's the thing that the reason the Roger Moore Bonds don't play as well anymore is because they were a little bit fantastical. I mean, Bond in outer space, Bond, underwater in a car. I mean, some of this stuff got to be ridiculous. Even when Pierce Brosnan did his last movie, Die Another Day, with Halle Berry,
right.
When he had that invisible car, the fans hated that. It was just a terrible idea. So I think that, the first few Connery Bonds were very realistic through Thunderball. I thought that the first 4, so they would play well today. When they started to go into outer space with You Only Live Twice, and it was a little too much for me. I think that the other thing that the Bond films face today is they face competition. They have to compete with the Jason Bourne movies, the Mission Impossible movies, the Kingsman. They all have a lot of action in them and really well done action. And even a series like The Fast and the Furious, those car chase movies.
Sure, right.
If you're going to do a car chase in a Bond movie, you got to compete with those guys.
But don't you think, I mean, he that was the original. I mean, sometimes being first is, one of the biggest parts. I mean, I don't think, I personally, even if it was not up to the special effects of another movie, just knowing the iconic character James Bond, I'd want to go see it. I mean, just because of who it is.
Well, it's interesting. Even though the film series is very successful, they still have to intrigue new audiences. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons, and this latest movie, No Time to Die, has done pretty well foreign, but its domestic box office has been hurt by the fact that over 45 people are not going. The audience for a James Bond movie is really what they call 4 quadrant. It appeals to everybody, but because of the COVID, they haven't had the numbers they wanted domestically, although the film has done very well foreign, and it will be just fine. but they also have to intrigue a new audience. So they got to come up with something clever. Now, going back to those Roger Moore Bond movies, when they introduced The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977, they introduced that character Jaws, the guy with the steel teeth, Richard Kiel.
Richard Kiel, that was his
name. The kids loved him. They loved that character so much that they brought him back in Moonraker. So the thing is, the Bond producers are always trying to figure out what will appeal to a new generation. But they've done well. I have no doubt that within the year we'll have a new James Bond, we'll have a new James Bond movie heading toward production, and it'll keep the cycle going. It's a series that will never end as far as I can see.
Well, that's I'm glad you're on right now, because I mean, one of the things, and again, we're not going to give anything away, but at the end of the film last weekend, No Time to Die, I was wondering, well, where is this going to go from here? I mean, and it's touchy. Do you have any ideas, without giving away too much, where you possibly think it might go?
Well, first of all, they once again at the end of this Bond movie, it says James Bond will return. Duh.
Right.
Kind of come back. Right. So, they're going to probably hire a white guy from the Commonwealth. Uh-huh. He'll be a Brit, he'll be an Australian, he'll be a Welshman, he'll be a Scotsman. He will be of that ilk, and it'll probably be a white guy. It's just the series that's what it's all about. There was talk of a female James Bond. In fact, in this Bond movie, as people noticed, they gave the 007 orientation to a black woman.
That's right.
Simply because it was the number. They didn't she's not James Bond. She's just using 007 because 007 has retired. And for the listeners who haven't seen the new Bond movie, it's not giving anything away. James Bond is living in retirement in Jamaica. He's there. Right. So, I think that there have been a number of actors they've been talking about, but I have a feeling someone's lurking in the wings that we don't know.
Right. And that's exciting too, because I mean, just look what it's turned some people into. And some people say, well, you should change, you should do this. No, I wouldn't want to see Charlie's Angels with Vince Vaughn or something like that, as the three guys as being an angel, and changing the whole gender and where they're from and all that. That's how Ian Fleming wrote the character. Don't you agree? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, exactly. And it's an iconic character that goes back to the 1950s. It is ironic that they've written a number of James Bond novels since Ian Fleming died in 1964.
I didn't know that.
Wow. Oh yeah, he died right before the release of Goldfinger, and they've never adapted any of the subsequent Bond movies. They've always been original screenplays created out of the ether. It's like they don't want to base a movie on anything that wasn't created by Ian Fleming.
Right.
So there you have it. Although I hear that some of the books, I haven't read them, but some of the books are pretty good. But it's going to keep going. It's going to keep going, and I enjoy writing about it. My latest book, the James Bond Movie Encyclopedia, is packed full of color photographs. It's my first book with color.
Oh, neat.
I've got all the behind the scenes details. It's a fun book to open up and read. And it's a great gift book.
How can, and we'll put all that up on the screen and in the descriptions for those listening, but how can we get a hold of it?
Okay, the James Bond Movie Encyclopedia, the best way to order it is on Amazon. It's right there, lickety split, and I'm very proud of it. My other book, the previous book, is also there at Amazon as well, the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia, which covers the first incarnation of the Twilight Zone, not the subsequent color incarnations.
Okay, the ones going back with Rod Serling, back in the originals, back with the series, so to speak. And I was going to kind of go into that. So you've got, I mean, you're really into some of these classic, shows and characters and things like that. I take it you were always a movie buff, huh?
I was, and it's funny because my first book, out of college, I went to UCLA, came out as a journalism student. My first book was called Combat Films, American Realism, 1945 to 1970. It was an anthology of stories about the making of the classic World War II movies. Well, I had a lot of fun. It was kind of like a film school for me, interviewing the classic filmmakers who made films like Patton and The Great Escape, A Walk in the Sun, Hell is for Heroes, Bridge on the River Kwai. But when the book came out, it sold 500 copies. And I said to my friends, I said, if this is my success for writing books, I better find another discipline. So I actually got into public relations work. I worked for the studios for about 30 years doing PR for movies.
Okay.
And but I decided that if I'm going to write a film or a television history book, I better pick a subject that is more interesting to people than combat films of World War II. And that's why I jumped into James Bond. I was there at the right time because no one had done a behind the scenes history of this great series that by the 70s was a pretty major thing. So I was very fortunate.
How'd you get, that was all done through MGM, right? I believe. How'd you go about doing that? I mean, did you interview, the different actors, the people on the writers, things like that? I mean, what was your process?
Thank you. I went to the key person to start the whole ball rolling, and that was Albert R. Broccoli.
Right.
Albert R. Broccoli was the key producer on the James Bond movies. I went to his office. I introduced myself. I told him about combat films because I had a book under my belt, and I went in there and interviewed him, and I had a great time. He was very nice. He introduced me to his stepson, Michael Wilson, in London. I went over that summer, and I started interviewing not only a lot of the people involved with the Bond movies, but they opened up the filing cabinets to me so that I could see a lot of the key production information so that it would inform my first book. My first book was not an encyclopedia. It was called The James Bond Films, A Behind the Scenes History. And that was the first book that explored the history of the Bond films. I've always believed that if you're going to write about a certain type of film series or TV series, you've got to get cooperation from the filmmakers, because otherwise you're just writing as a fan on the outside. And I wanted to write as a pure film historian, just like I would be writing about the history of King Tut. I wanted to get the key information. So when it came time to write the Twilight Zone encyclopedia, I reached out to Carol Serling, who was Rod's widow. And once again, I got the filing cabinets open to me. So I got, not in my Twilight Zone encyclopedia, I actually have most of the salaries of the actors who worked on that series. And it's kind of interesting to see what top of scale was in 1959 to be in a star in a Twilight Zone. And, the top of scale at that time was $5,000, which seems like nothing today.
And that's for one of the stars, huh?
Right.
Was that because they were all studio performers at that time? They were owned by the studio, weren't they?
Well, the Twilight Zone was a co-production between Rod Serling's own company, which was called. God, I'm just blanking for a second, but with CBS. CBS was the financing entity. Twilight Zone was on the air for 5 years. There were 156 episodes, and Rod Serling wrote 92 of them.
I didn't realize. Oh, he actually wrote them? Rod Serling did?
Yeah.
I had no idea. So Rod Serling, I thought he was just the talking head. I had no idea he wrote those.
Oh yeah, Rod Serling comes to television. He started his career in radio, but then when he was one of the pioneers of live television dramatic writing. He won 3 Emmys going back to the 1950s, and he wrote things like Requiem for a Heavyweight and The Comedian and Patterns, which were really landmark drama films of that period.
Rod Serling. So that really blows me away. I didn't know that. So Rod Serling was actually a screenwriter.
He was a screenwriter and a very very unique writer in the sense that he really reached out to the common man. And I think the reason those Twilight Zone episodes still work today, and we just got through seeing a bunch of them on New Year's Eve, they always run that marathon
right.
on the Sci-Fi Channel, is that they appeal to just average people. These are things that could happen to any of us.
Right.
And I think that Rod had a real specialty on creating great riveting dialogue. He was a World War II veteran who came out of the war with PTSD. I mean, he was traumatized in the Philippines. He was a paratrooper who landed on Luzon, at the end of the war and saw horrific things.
Wow. That really, I I had no idea. That's really wild.
No, he was great, and I think that he poured himself into the series. He was getting frustrated with live television at that time. They wouldn't let him do anything controversial.
Mhm.
So he used the science fiction, fantasy, and horror genre to start telling his morality tales for the masses. He was the first writer to write about the Holocaust. First writer to write about Vietnam, child endangerment, all these issues of the day, which were considered taboo on regular television. I mean, television in the late 50s was about Westerns and cop shows and game shows,
Right.
with a few exceptions. Rod was in in the same league as Paddy Chayefsky, Reginald Rose, those kinds of writers.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. Wow, well, I wasn't aware of all this. So you've obviously you've studied a lot of other shows and other series and things like that. But you're also, are you developing your own material? Are you pitching your own shows yourself now?
Yes. When I was a film publicist, I went to Showtime in the early 1990s, and I became a staff publicist there when they were building up their film, films that they were putting on the channel. And I got to produce my first film in 2002. It was called Bleacher Bums. A lot of people remember the play. It's about the Chicago Cubs fans who sit out there and Wrigley and just watch a losing team every year. Obviously, this was written before 2016. So we produced it. Yeah, we shot it in Toronto that summer of 2001. It came out in 2002. And then I got my producing career going. I did a World War II drama for the Hallmark Channel next.
Okay.
And that was called Silent Night.
Okay. Is that still available? Because my wife is addicted to the Hallmark Channel. She probably knows every single one. She's probably watched your particular episode 40 times.
Well, I would hope so. It's Linda Hamilton, the lady from those Terminator movies, played the lead character. It's an interesting story. She plays a German woman who was in a cabin in the Ardennes on Christmas Eve, 1944, in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, when American and German combat troops both ended up at her cabin, and she held a truce for 12 hours, and they broke bread together. They sang songs, and they left as friends in the morning. True story.
Wow, I'm really learning a whole lot here today, Steve. What other new stuff are you working on? Are you pitching? I think you mentioned you've got some new projects.
Yes, I'm pitching all over the place. I'm writing a lot of comedy, but I'm also developing with Arthur Friedman, who's a producer in Florida. He produced the Bobby Darin biopic a few years ago with Kevin Spacey.
Right.
Exactly. Well, we've teamed up to do a limited series about the life of Audie Murphy.
Okay. Well, tell us a little bit about that.
Audie Murphy, some people will remember, was a World War II veteran who was the most decorated soldier in American history. He won 33 medals for bravery during World War II. And after the war, he came to Hollywood and became a movie star. He starred in 40 Westerns.
Okay.
He was a very popular Western movie star, but he suffered from PTSD. And it became a major trouble for him, although nobody knew about it. If you saw pictures of Audie Murphy at that time, he had those movie star good looks. He was a sweet man. Everybody thought he was America's sweetheart, but he had severe trouble. So we think it's a great TV series concept to talk about how PTSD affects our veterans. And Audie himself was a fascinating character. He was a poor boy from Texas who had nothing, and he fudged his enlistment papers so he could join the army at 17. And he was a little guy. He was like 5'4" and 125 pounds. And yet he fought in every major campaign in Europe and won the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's quite a story.
Wow, sounds like a great story. So are you writing this too, or are you still researching, or what stage are you at?
Well, we just brought in David S. Ward, who won the Academy Award for the movie The Sting back in the day.
Oh, wow. That was one of my favorites.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And he also wrote Major League and Sleepless in Seattle. He's a very, very accomplished screenwriter. So he's on our team, and we're talking to partners right now. It's a process.
Yeah, it's a long process too, isn't it? It takes a lot.
It takes forever. And I'm partnered with Billy Reback, who's a very fine comedy writer. Billy was one of the original writer producers on the Tim Allen series Home Improvement.
Mhm.
And Billy and I have known each other for years, and we've been out there trying to sell comedies, fun comedies that you can take the whole family to see. We feel that a lot of comedy today, when it gets to the theater or wherever on a streamer, it's very raunchy. And we kind of want to go back to kind of a family comedy approach. We're big fans of films like Ghostbusters and Night at the Museum, Back to the Future. We think there's market for that kind of comedy.
Oh, I think so too. I mean, a lot of people don't even know what they're missing. I mean, it just seems like an easy, like you're just mailing it in, to use vulgarity a lot of times, and just, go the raunchy route. And that kind of leads me to what I was going to ask you next. You've obviously studied and researched a lot of old Hollywood through these other projects you have, and now that you're dealing with the new project, in your opinion, how have things changed over the decades from, that glamorous, age of Hollywood with Sean Connery, as you were saying, to now? It's a whole different animal, isn't it?
Very much so. I mean, the movies seem to be focused on tent poles. Remember, I was saying that the James Bond movies were like the first tent poles for the studios, and the movies, they still make all different types of movies, but I would say that the majority of Hollywood's financing goes into superhero movies and science fiction epics, because they're targeting young people under 25s. So the audience has changed completely for movies, where the audience is pretty much, if you want to go see an adult story, you're going to see it on television at one of the streamers.
Right.
It was pointed out to me on one of the great movies of the 70s, All the President's Men, about Watergate with Redford and Dustin Hoffman.
Sure.
If that was pitched today, it would probably go to HBO. It would not go to a studio.
Oh no, I've heard the same thing. I've heard the way, especially with the way that the theaters are struggling, that the future may be just these giant events to go see the next Marvel movie, where you can see it on the big screen. And I also heard from other people that I work with that if you want to come out with a comedy now, it's almost destined to go streaming. It won't even make it to the big screen. I mean, do you see that?
It's very true. In fact, if you look at the movies today, it is so expensive to put a movie in theaters because of the need to advertise on television, that you basically eliminate most of the types of movies that people are producing that have to go to streaming. For instance, if you look at movies today, you have, for the most of the year, you see the tentpoles. You see these big action extravaganzas and an occasional musical. And then toward the end of the year, starting in September, you start seeing all of the awards consideration movie, which I always laugh and say, this is depressing movie time. Most of the movies are pretty depressing.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, the audience, you and I grew up on movies, all kinds of movies.
Constantly.
I mean, you'd see a comedy in one week, you'd see an adventure movie, a Tarzan movie. They're all different types of movies. It is interesting that I think from a pure financing point of view, that the movie theater type of movie is an expensive movie, because those are the only people who can afford to put them in theaters, are studios that have big advertising budgets. So the bulk of movies now will go to streamers. People have been building up their big screens and their sound systems over the years.
Sure.
But and of course, for young people under 25, they don't want to stay home and watch the movie on their parents' couch or whatever couch they have. They want to go to the theater, because that's where they hang out with their friends and your significant other. So that's why the movies that go to the theaters are generally geared for young people.
Oh, yeah. And I got to tell you, I mean, just with all that's been going on, the pandemic and everything, I mean, Christmas Day, my wife and the family went. I was the first movie I had been to in a cinema in almost 2 years. And we went to see Kurt Warner's movie, American Underdog, which most people probably wouldn't go to his theater to see maybe, but I'm a huge Kurt Warner fan. I'm in St. Louis. I went through that whole era. He's the greatest guy in the entire world if you ever get to meet him. So I wanted to go see it in the theater. And so we went Christmas Day. That's another thing I've never done. And when we went in, it was like, I mean, recliner seats. The seats were heated. They it was like with a gigantic sound system, and it was like I thought, wow. This must be where it's going. And this was just, it was a great film, by the way. I loved it, the Kurt Warner American Underdog. But I thought if you were watching like a Marvel movie or something, it'd be like going to Universal and going on a theme park ride. So, something like that, I could see actually paying for. But like you were saying, some of the other films that are a little bit more thought provoking and you're just, or even a comedy, maybe they're all going to go the streaming route. Now, I don't really think there's anything wrong.
I don't think Hollywood knows. This Steven Spielberg musical remake that just came out, West Side Story, just didn't do any business at all. And I think again, it's because the over 45s who appreciated the original aren't going to the movies. This movie that opened last weekend, the 355 with Jessica Chastain, an action adventure, sounds like a female Mission Impossible. Didn't do any business. I think Hollywood's scratching their heads a little bit because we're kind of stuck in the limbo. We're not quite back to going to movie theaters. Actually, I don't even think it's a question of quite. We're not going back to movie theaters because of the current COVID until the handcuffs are off and people can move about freely. I don't think Hollywood knows what's going to happen.
No, that's unfortunate. But, like James Bond, it'll always be back. That's one thing. Everybody's going to love going to the movies. That's nothing. I don't think in one form or another, there's always going to be cinemas. So they may have to adapt and evolve somewhat, but I think they'll always be there. Well, we got a couple of minutes left. Tell us a little bit about your podcast that you have. I take it it's on Saturdays, Saturday Night at the Movies. Steve Rubin, Saturday Night at the Movies. What's that all about? Is it history or is it current films? Or
I do a mixture. I say that we showcase cult, classic, and current. I'm really interested in history and hearing from people who were involved in the actual movies. Our debut podcast was an interview with Donna Anderson, who was the last surviving star of one of the great anti-nuke movies of the 50s, On the Beach.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Gregory Peck, Ava Gardner, and I had her on. She talked all about the making of that movie. This week we have my friend Steve Mitchell, who wrote the kind of cult classic movie Chopping Mall. Chopping Mall, which
okay.
That was a little horror movie from the 80s, and then we also talk about Lee Marvin's career with the author of a book on the life of Lee Marvin. Then we talk about his Western, The Professionals. I just recorded a podcast with Paul Davids, who produced a movie for Showtime in the 90s called Roswell, all about the purported Roswell flying saucer crash in 1947. So I picked kind of a kaleidoscope of different movies and talk about how those movies were made and with some of the original participants or authors who are experts in their field.
That's really awesome. Well, I tell you, I can't wait to check it out because it's really interesting. You've been fascinating. All the stuff that, I personally learned about today, and I know everybody else has too. And again, we'll put all the links, in our descriptions and also on screen here, so people can find your James Bond book, the Twilight Zone book, as well as your podcast. That's Steve Rubin's Saturday Night at the Movies. I really want to thank you for being here, Steve. It's been great. It's one of my favorite shows. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. I appreciate it. Happy New Year.
Hey, Happy New Year to you too, and stay safe. And we'll have to catch up and do this again. All right.
Sounds good.
Thanks a lot. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining me, and I hope you'll join me next time. Until then, I'm Todd Schowalter, and you've been watching and listening to Right Mind. And remember, if you don't have a right mind, you don't have a mind at all. Till next time, bye-bye.
This has been the Right Mind Podcast with Todd Schowalter.